Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Mulondo. I'm going to present on the subject of health education, HE10D1 for the degree program first year. This presentation is divided into two sections. The first section is based on some guidelines for you that you need for the preparation of the exam. I'm going to look at different tips or practical guides that you can do or use or apply before the exam, and then also during the exam. And then the second section of this presentation is then also on the content of the subject itself, what you expect, and I call it the examination profile or scoping. So very important for you as a student, although this content is there to assist you, it is still expected from you as a student to have an understanding of the whole subject. So you have to understand the whole subject. You have to read through the whole chapter so that you can have a better understanding what the subject is entailed or what is expected from you. So it's very important. You have to read through the whole book. You have to read through the whole manual. You have to look at additional information. For example, like the internet, you can search Google, or you can also go to your library. So the first section is I'm going to look at certain things that I've experienced with students when they prepare themselves for the exam, and then also from my own experience also in preparation for the exam papers. Now, before the exam, it's very advisable that you need to have a timetable, whether it's 2 months before or 1 month. Before the exam, you need to come up with a timetable. If your subjects are divided into 10 chapters or 15 units or chapters, you have to divide those units within the period of those 2 months or 1 month. Whether you've got 2 chapters a week that you have to do, or you've got 1 chapter, it all depends on you. So it's very important that you need to have a timetable. 3 things that you have to do. The first thing is you have to read through the content of the chapters, the context, to have a better understanding. Don't start to memorize right away. Don't start to study. First thing is read through to understand, from chapter 1 up to the last chapter. The second thing what you do is, while you are reading, is make notes, things that you don't understand, keywords, concepts. Make extra notes on your study manual, make extra notes in the book, because those notes will help you that when you start to do revision, you can just go through those notes as part of the preparation. Then thirdly is, when you are going to do the revision, it's very important that at least a week before, or before you're going to write the subject, that you go through your notes, you read through it, and to make sure that you have a better understanding what the subject is all about. So it's very important that you have to prepare yourself. So don't make that mistake, and a day before the exam you suddenly want to go through the whole book and you want to study and you want to memorize. This is where most students make the mistake, and where they can actually fail the exam. So it's better to be prepared before the exam starts. Now, during the exam, when you have the exam paper in front of you, there are certain things that you have to do. The first thing is read through all the questions. There are 6 questions on the exam paper. You only need to choose 5. Make sure that you read through all the 6 questions, and by the time you select the number 2, the questions, then you first start with a question that's easier for you. The question that you know that you can answer, it's much easier, you can write it. Because the challenge is if you start with a question that's very difficult, you might find yourself wasting time. By the time you want to write the easiest question, then your time is very limited. Remember, some papers are having 2 hours, some papers are only written for 3 hours. So make sure that you read through the question and then you select the questions. So after you have selected the question and you start with the question, don't just write. First read the question to understand the content of that question. And after you have read the question, then what you have to do, you have to answer the question. Don't interpret the question. Don't try to assume this is what the question is all about. answer the question that's been asked. It's very, very important. So those are the tips that you can learn, that you can do as part of your preparation. So the second session is we're going to go through the content of the subject, health education. Now, health education is very comprehensive. It's a very holistic subject, and as you can remember from previous presentation, and also looking at your study manual, you will find that health education cover a number of subjects. So it's very important still, as I've said earlier, for you as a student to have an understanding of all the subject, to know the content of the whole subject, and not just the thematic areas which we are actually covering right now during this presentation. So the first thing that I want to look at as part of your health education is the whole issue of sanitation. Sanitation is actually linked to many aspects of personal hygiene. You can also link sanitation with the access of water, the availability of water, and then also the quality of water, because sanitation does not just look at the facilities like the toilets and other sanitary facilities that's available. It also look at your behavior. You have community members that are using open defecation where there is no toilets, especially in informal settlement. This is where you have to discuss in detail, define what is sanitation. Then discuss in detail what are sanitary, what facilities do you find when it comes to sanitation. The behavior, what is unsanitary behaviors, practices, for example. What are the advantages if people are having healthy sanitation practices? What are the disadvantages? So in your examination or in your discussion, you have to look this in detail. How does sanitation have an impact on the health of people? What effects are there? What negative effects are there? So it's very important that when you discuss this issue on sanitation, you have to look everything in detail. So in the exam paper, when you are going to write that, you're going to write all those aspects. So if you don't have an understanding, preferably by now, I will advise you to go to a library to read more about sanitation, hygiene, to read more about, and even Google, just to understand, have an understanding about the subject itself. Then secondly, we're going to look at OVCs. Now, when you are working with orphans and vulnerable children, or with children in general, especially when they're orphans, there are certain things that you have to do as part of looking after them, and this is feeding, giving food to these children. Now, when you are going to give food, some countries, they have what they call feeding schemes. Is you have to feed food to these children. Now, there are certain practices that are being done in different countries when it comes to feeding practices for children. Now, in your paper or in your discussion, you're going to look at the different practices that are there. You are going to look at how are children being fed. Who are those children that are being fed or they are being fed? So there are practices that are harmful, there are practices that are not even harmful. But when you are going to, for example, going to work in an informal settlement where there is poor community and there are poor children, what kind of feeding practices will you have? There are different methods, there are different strategies. Some are having soup kitchens, some are having coupons. So there are so many practices. Now, in your discussion or in your paper, you have to give practical example. You have to explain in detail what these practices is all about, which are very, very much more important. Then the aspects of alcohol and drugs. Now, this is a very vague subject. It's a big subject. It's got so many elements. When you talk about alcohol itself, there are so many elements that you have to look at alcohol. You are looking at alcohol use and abuse. You are looking at the factors that contribute to alcohol abuse or alcohol abuse. Yes. What are the negative results or consequences when you use alcohol? How do you link alcohol abuse with HIV infection, for example, or different behavior or negative behavior? Then you're looking at drugs. There are different kinds of drugs. How people abuse drugs and what influence does drugs have or drugs abuse have on the health of people. You can look at different interventions that different countries are doing, especially in Namibia when it comes to alcohol and drug abuse. What interventions are there? What programs are in place to address alcohol and drugs abuse? Talking about awareness, talking about IEC materials, information, education, communication materials that are available, looking at training, capacity building to communities as part of the intervention to address alcohol and drug abuse. So this is what you have to discuss in the paper. You have to look this in detail, explain and define what does this abuse mean, and then also give example. And of course, when you give example, I refer to practical example, where you give practical example in the context of alcohol and drug abuse, and how that also have an influence on the community at large. Then the other thing is marriage as part of health education. What impact does HIV has on marriages? And when you look at marriages, you're going to define what constitutes marriage. You're going to look at different aspects of marriages, different elements of marriages. Who are marriages? We are looking at the issues of couples and how that is infected. What do you do in a situation where one of the partner in the marriage is HIV positive? What do you do? How do you educate this couple? How do you counsel, for example, this couple when it comes to marriage and HIV? So it's very important for you that in your discussion or in your paper, you're going to bring out the issues of HIV and marriage, the issue of spousal treatment, spousal abuse in a marriage. That's part of the contributing factor of HIV. What about violence in a marriage? What about so many aspects that you can actually look at? It's just one of the examples that I can give you. So it's very important that when you are going to study or you're going to prepare yourself for the examination, you have to know about marriages, HIV, and how do you link the two aspects or the two things together. Very, very much more important, because there is so many ignorance currently that you find people that are getting married, and because of their ignorance they don't go for HIV testing, they don't go for marital counseling. You even find that some of the marital counseling does not cover HIV as part of the preventive mode or preventive counseling advice to couples. So in your paper you have to discuss in detail is how do you bring in the aspect of HIV in this marriage counseling session in order to prepare the couple. What do you do, for example, if you ask the couple if they go for a pre-test counseling or for VCT, voluntary counseling testing? What if one of the spouse is HIV positive? Will they still go ahead with the marriage? Or the wedding? How do they prevent reinfection in the marriage? The use of ARV. So there are so many dynamics that you can have to look at when it comes to the linkages of marriage and HIV/AIDS. So in health education, this is one of the most important subjects which a lot of people are ignorant with. And you find so many couples, especially in Namibia, that are getting married and they do not go for HIV/AIDS counseling and testing even before they are being married or they are getting married. Then we go to sexual abuse. What do you do with sex abuse or sexual abuse, and how is that linked to HIV/AIDS? And when we look at sexual abuse, some people are using sexual violence. For example, rape. How do you link rape with HIV? If somebody is sexually violated through rape, for example, and this person discovered that he or she is HIV positive. So how do you deal with such issue when you are going to counsel that person? So this is in your paper, in your exam. You have to discuss these factors. What does the current law say? Does the current law protect sexual abuse victims? How are they being protected? Sexual abuse in a relationship between a husband and wife, or a boyfriend and a girlfriend. Sexual abuse, children, for example, parents and children, or a family member. How do you present this, and how do you link this situation, for example, with HIV infection? So in your paper, you have to bring out very easy. You have to first define and explain what the abuse is all about, the different levels of abuse. You can give different examples of abuse, and then also link them with HIV/AIDS, which are very, very important for you to understand and to know that you have to bring those linkages, and you have to explain in detail how this. And then, of course, the impact it's having. You can also link this with the law. With the legal reform. Is there any legal reform that's in place that actually address sexual abuse and HIV/AIDS? What does the law say in the protection of the abused? Then you can also look at the health facilities, the health infrastructures. What infrastructures are there? Mechanism, are there any mechanism in place when it comes to sexual abuse and HIV/AIDS? Does the Ministry of Health make provision, for example, for people that are being abused sexually? And what mechanism is in place? The law enforcement, like the police, what do they do to protect rape victims, for example? So these are all the things that you can actually discuss. It's very holistic, so you can bring up a comprehensive approach. And this is all part of health education, because at the end, you are not just educating yourself, you're also educating the community. What if you are appointed as a community health educator, and you have to, or a health promoter, you have to talk about sexual abuse and HIV/AIDS? What would be the content of your presentation? What themes are you going to talk about? So you have to bring out those different thematic areas on the issue of sexual abuse and HIV/AIDS, which is very important, especially when you want to form the linkages of that. Then, of course, not just HIV/AIDS. What about the youth? Many young people are experiencing sexual violence. How does a young people deal with sexual violence? Are there any referral systems? Where do you refer a young people, a person that comes to you and confide in you? And how do you bring in the law reinforcement or law enforcement agency like the police? What does the law say if there is a case and it needs to go to the court of law? How is a sexual violence victim protected by the court itself? What if this young person is underage? So these are all the aspects that you have to discuss. You have to look in detail. You have to give example and discuss in detail how do you protect these different aspects. And so many young people are facing a lot of sexual violence, not just in a home but also in friends. You've got, for example, a rape dating, where young people, they go on a date and one of them drug them and put something in the alcohol or in their drinks, and then they are being violated. So how do you deal? So these are the things that you have to bring out in your paper, that you have to read and to look at. Then we've got the continuum of care. We have already talked about this in the past. Remember, we talk about home-based care, and there is a different process that you have to follow. It's like a cycle. That's why we call it a continuum. And when you talk about home-based care and giving care services, it's a continuation. It's not just a once-off program or intervention, but it's a continuation intervention. So in your paper, you have to give different examples of care. What is care? What is home-based care? Different types of care. And then what are the process, what procedures are being followed. So these are some of the things that you have to look at, and then you have to make sure that you cover this in the paper about the whole cycle of care and support, especially those that are chronic and those that are HIV positive. So you have to look into this in detail. Then of course in your paper there is also fairness of scaling up HIV care, and this is all part of the HIV care and support. Is how do you make sure that the client that's coming to you, or a client that's under your care, that you are going to give fair services, that you are going to make sure that the service that this person is going to get is comprehensive, and the person will get quality service. Many a times you find that somebody that's chronic, or that's full-blown AIDS, or that's bedridden, they experience so much discrimination and ill treatment, not just from the caregivers but also from family members. Now in your discussion is you are going to educate community members that are actually volunteering to care for their family members. So how are you going to address the concept of fairness? And how are you going to apply it in practical life? Because remember, you want the whole word scaling up means you want to improve, you want to increase, you want to make sure that there is quality care and not just a lot of care for people living with HIV/AIDS, but you want to make sure that people are getting quality service. And this is where you can also talk about it, and in your discussion you can also bring out the whole issue of fairness and then scaling up of your HIV care. So I have then come to the end of my presentation, and I hope that this presentation was helpful. It will also help you to prepare for your exams. So, and as I said earlier, is make sure that you understand the whole subject and not just certain chapters. And I hope that you will follow the tips, the guidelines I've given you to prepare yourself for the exam. And I wish you all the best with your exam. And thank you for listening to me.